Two strange women load my groceries into their car while screaming at me for being a thief. But that's exactly what happened when I returned from my grocery run to my remote lake cabin. Before you watch full story, comment down from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe. It was a Friday afternoon in late September, and I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. My buddy Jake had let me borrow his family's lake cabin for a long weekend, 3 days of fishing, grilling, and absolutely no responsibilities. The cabin was perfect. Tucked away on Lake Serenity about 2 hours outside the city, it was the kind of place where you could actually hear yourself think. No traffic, no neighbors, just pine trees, clear water, and blessed silence. I had driven up Thursday night with a car full of supplies, fishing gear, a cooler, some basic groceries, and enough beer to last the weekend. But by Friday afternoon, I realized I had underestimated my appetite. The bacon was gone, I was down to my last 2 beers, and I had foolishly thought a single bag of chips would last 3 days. Time for a grocery run. The nearest store was Pinewood Market, a small family-owned grocery store about 20 minutes down the mountain. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and city folks like me stuck out like a sore thumb. I made my list. More beer, steaks for Saturday night, breakfast supplies, snacks, and some firewood if they had it. Simple enough. The drive down was beautiful, winding mountain roads, fall colors just starting to show, and that crisp mountain air that makes you feel like you're in a commercial for outdoor gear. I should have known it was too perfect to last. Pinewood Market was exactly what you'd expect from a small mountain town grocery store. One of those places where they still had wooden floors that creaked when you walked, and the owner's dog was sleeping by the register. I grabbed a cart and started my shopping. The beer selection was limited but adequate, the meat looked fresh, and they had everything else I needed. I was actually enjoying the small-town grocery experience. No crowds, no rushing, just peaceful shopping. That's when I first noticed them. 2 women, probably in their late 40s, with that unmistakable suburban mom energy that somehow felt out of place in this mountain town setting. They were having a loud conversation about organic prices while examining regular apples. "I cannot believe they don't have organic quinoa here, Susan," the taller one was saying. "What kind of establishment doesn't carry organic quinoa?" "I know, right? And look at these prices, Margaret. $3 for apples? In the city we get better apples for half the price." I tried to ignore them and focus on my shopping, but their voices carried through the small store. They were clearly tourists like me, but the entitled kind who expected every small town to cater to their city expectations. I grabbed my steaks, loaded up on beer, and headed for the checkout. The owner, a friendly older gentleman named Earl, rang up my purchases while his dog watched hopefully for dropped treats. "You staying up at the lake?" Earl asked. "Yeah, the Johnson cabin. Beautiful spot." "Oh, Jake's family place. Nice kid. You picked a good weekend for it, supposed to be clear and warm." As Earl bagged my groceries, I could hear the 2 women still complaining about the store's limited selection. I felt bad for whoever had to deal with them. I loaded my bags into my car, a blue Honda Civic that had seen better days but was reliable, and headed back up the mountain. The sun was starting to set, and I was looking forward to grilling those steaks and watching the sunset over the lake. I had no idea I was being followed. The drive back to the cabin was just as beautiful as the drive down. I had my windows down, music playing, and I was already planning my evening. Grill the steaks, crack open a cold beer, maybe try some night fishing. I pulled into the gravel driveway of the cabin and immediately noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was another car in the driveway. A white SUV with city plates, parked right next to the cabin like it belonged there. My first thought was that maybe Jake's family had decided to come up for the weekend and forgot to tell me. But that didn't make sense. Jake had specifically said the cabin was mine for the weekend. I parked behind the SUV, grabbed my grocery bags, and walked toward the cabin. That's when I saw them. Margaret and Susan, the 2 women from the grocery store, were sitting on the cabin's front porch like they owned the place. "Excuse me," I called out, completely confused. "Can I help you?" Margaret stood up, hands on her hips. "You can start by explaining why you're at our cabin." I stared at her. "Your cabin?" "We rented this cabin for the weekend," Susan chimed in. "We have the confirmation email and everything." "I think there's been a mistake," I said, setting down my grocery bags. "I'm staying here this weekend. My friend Jake's family owns this cabin." "That's impossible," Margaret declared. "We paid good money for this rental." I pulled out my phone to call Jake, but of course there was no cell signal. The cabin was in one of those dead zones where you had to drive halfway down the mountain to get bars. "Look," I said, trying to be reasonable, "I think there might be some confusion here. Let me just grab the key and we can sort this out." I reached into my pocket for the cabin key that Jake had given me. Don't you dare. Susan shrieked. That's breaking and entering. It's not breaking and entering if I have the key, I said, showing them the key. You probably stole that key, Margaret accused. I was starting to get a bad feeling about this situation. These women were clearly not reasonable people. Tell you what, I said, why don't we both call whoever we're supposed to call and sort this out? I'll call Jake, you call whoever you rented from. We don't have to prove anything to you. Margaret snapped. You're the one who's trespassing. I'm not trespassing. I'm supposed to be here. Prove it. I looked around helplessly. No cell service, no neighbors within shouting distance, and two women who were absolutely convinced they were right. That's when I noticed Susan eyeing my grocery bags with an odd expression. Nice groceries, she said casually. Thanks. Must have been expensive, all that beer and those steaks. I didn't like where this was going. It's fine. I'm on vacation. You know, Margaret said, since you're clearly not supposed to be here and we are, it seems only fair that you should leave those groceries as compensation for the inconvenience you've caused us. I stared at her. You want me to give you my groceries? It's the least you can do after trying to steal our cabin. I'm not trying to steal anything. I'm supposed to be here. Then where's your proof? Susan demanded. Where's yours? I shot back. That's when Margaret pulled out her phone. I'm calling the police. Good, I said. Let's get this sorted out. But as she dialed, I realized I had a problem. I was in the middle of nowhere with no cell service, no way to contact Jake, and no way to prove I was supposed to be there except for a key that anyone could have. Meanwhile, these women probably did have some sort of rental confirmation, even if it was fake or for a different cabin. I was starting to feel like I was in a bad situation. Yes, hello. Margaret spoke into her phone. I need to report a trespasser. We're at our rental cabin and there's a man here who claims he's supposed to be here. Yes, he has groceries. No, he's refusing to leave. I could hear the tinny voice of the dispatcher on the other end, but couldn't make out the words. The address? It's, Margaret looked around. Susan, what's the address here? I don't know, it's just the cabin by the lake. We're at a cabin on Lake Serenity, Margaret said into the phone. There's only one road up here. Yes, we'll wait. She hung up and turned to me with a smug smile. The police are on their way. Great, I said. I look forward to getting this sorted out. But as we waited, something strange happened. Susan kept looking at my grocery bags with increasing interest. You know, she said to Margaret, he did go to the same store we did. So maybe he saw us shopping and followed us here. I looked at Susan incredulously. Followed you here? Why would I follow you here? To steal our cabin, Margaret said like it was obvious. If I wanted to steal a cabin, why would I buy groceries first? To make it look like you were supposed to be here, Susan explained, clearly proud of her detective work. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Is it? Margaret said. Or is it the perfect crime? I realized I was dealing with people who had constructed an entire conspiracy theory around me buying groceries and driving to a cabin I had a key to. Let me get this straight, I said. You think I saw you at the grocery store, followed you to a cabin, and now I'm pretending to be staying here so I can, what? Steal your vacation? It makes perfect sense, Susan said. It makes no sense at all. That's what someone who was stealing a cabin would say, Margaret pointed out. I sat down on the porch steps, suddenly exhausted. This is insane. You know what's insane? Susan said. Buying all those expensive groceries just to commit a crime. I bought groceries because I was hungry. Sure you did. That's when Susan made her move. She walked over to my grocery bags and picked one up. Hey, I said, standing up. Put that down. These are clearly stolen groceries, she declared. They're not stolen. I just bought them. From the same store we were at? Right after we left? That's very suspicious. It's not suspicious. It's shopping. But Susan was already looking through the bag. Look at this, Margaret. Expensive steaks, imported beer, fancy snacks. This is clearly stolen merchandise. I have the receipt, I said, reaching for my wallet. Receipts can be forged, Margaret said knowingly. Who forges grocery receipts? Criminals, Susan said like she was stating an obvious fact. I watched in disbelief as Susan started pulling items out of my grocery bags. These steaks alone are worth $50, she said. And this beer is imported. This is clearly stolen merchandise. Put my groceries back, I said firmly. Your groceries? Margaret laughed. How do we know these aren't our groceries that you somehow stole? Because I just bought them. Prove it. I showed them the receipt. They examined it like it was a piece of evidence in a murder trial. This receipt is clearly fake, Margaret declared. How is it fake? The timestamp is wrong. I looked at the receipt. The timestamp says 4:47 p.m. It's now 6:30 p.m. That's exactly how long it would take to shop and drive back here. Too convenient, Susan said. It's not convenient. It's logical. But they weren't listening. Susan was now unpacking all of my groceries and laying them out on the porch like evidence. Look at this spread, Margaret. This is clearly the haul of a professional thief. I'm not a professional thief. I'm a software engineer on vacation. That's what a professional thief would say. I realized I was in some sort of alternate reality where buying groceries was evidence of criminality. 20 minutes later, I heard the sound of gravel crunching under tires. A sheriff's deputy SUV pulled into the driveway behind my car. Deputy Williams was a middle-aged man with the patient demeanor of someone who had dealt with tourist disputes before. He looked at the scene, me, two women, and my groceries spread out on the porch like evidence, and sighed. Afternoon, folks. I understand there's some sort of dispute about this cabin. Margaret immediately launched into her story. Officer, this man has been trespassing on our rental property and we believe he's stolen these groceries as part of some elaborate scheme. Deputy Williams looked at me. Sir, what's your side of the story? I'm staying at this cabin for the weekend. My friend Jake's family owns it. I went to buy groceries and came back to find these women on the porch claiming they rented it. I see. Do you have any proof you're supposed to be here? I showed him the key. Jake gave me this key and told me I could use the cabin this weekend. Deputy Williams examined the key, then looked at Margaret and Susan. Ladies, do you have proof you rented this cabin? Of course we do, Margaret said, pulling out her phone. I have the confirmation email right here. She showed him her phone screen. Deputy Williams studied it carefully. Ma'am, this confirmation is for a cabin on Lake Harmony, not Lake Serenity. Margaret's face went blank. What? Lake Harmony is about 40 miles north of here. You're at the wrong lake. Susan grabbed the phone and stared at the screen. But the GPS brought us here. Did you put in the right address? We just searched for Lake Cabin Rental and followed the directions. Deputy Williams rubbed his forehead. So you're at the wrong cabin. But what about the groceries? Margaret demanded. He clearly stole those groceries. Ma'am, he has a receipt. The receipt is fake. Deputy Williams looked at the receipt, then at me. This receipt is from Pinewood Market, time-stamped about 2 hours ago. That's exactly how long it would take to shop and drive back here. That's what I tried to tell them, I said. And these groceries? Susan pointed to my food spread across the porch. This is clearly stolen merchandise. Ma'am, these look like normal groceries someone would buy for a weekend at a cabin. Beers, steaks, snacks. Nothing unusual here. But it's so expensive. It's a vacation, Deputy Williams said patiently. People tend to splurge a little on vacation. I could see the realization dawning on Margaret's face. They were at the wrong cabin. I was supposed to be here. And they had just spent the last hour accusing an innocent man of elaborate criminal activity. So, he's not a criminal? Susan asked weakly. No, ma'am. He's a tourist just like you. Except he's at the right cabin. You would think that being proven wrong would make reasonable people apologize and leave. But Margaret and Susan were not reasonable people. This is entrapment, Margaret declared. Deputy Williams looked confused. Ma'am, what's entrapment? You're all working together to make us look bad. Ma'am, you're at the wrong cabin. No one made you come here. But the GPS. Ma'am, GPS can make mistakes. That's why you should always verify addresses. Susan was now frantically repacking my groceries, but not in the bags they came in. She was just randomly shoving items into whatever container she could find. Hey, I said, be careful with those. These are stolen goods, she insisted. Ma'am, Deputy Williams said firmly, these are not stolen goods. Please put the gentleman's groceries back the way you found them. But, ma'am, if you don't return his property, I'll have to charge you with theft. Susan dropped the package of steaks she was holding. Theft. Yes, ma'am. Taking someone else's property without permission is theft. But he's the thief. Ma'am, he's not a thief. He bought groceries and came to a cabin he's supposed to be at. You're the ones who are at the wrong place. Margaret was now pacing back and forth on the porch like a caged animal. This is all wrong. The GPS wouldn't make a mistake like this. Ma'am, GPS makes mistakes all the time. Especially in rural areas. But we paid for this cabin. Yes, ma'am, and your cabin is about 40 miles north of here. But this cabin is nicer. Deputy Williams paused. Ma'am, that's not how rentals work. It should be. I was watching this meltdown with a mixture of fascination and horror. These women had gone from accusing me of elaborate crimes to having a full breakdown because technology had failed them. Look, I said, trying to be helpful. If you need directions to Lake Harmony, I can. Don't you dare. Margaret snapped. This is all your fault. How is this my fault? If you hadn't been here, we wouldn't have been confused. Deputy Williams stepped between us. Ma'am, this gentleman has done nothing wrong. You need to collect your things and head to your actual rental. But it's getting dark. Yes, ma'am, which is why you should leave now. Susan was still frantically handling my groceries, but now she seemed to be trying to rearrange them in some sort of organizational system. Ma'am, I said, please just put everything back in the bags. I'm trying to help. You're not helping. You're making it worse. Deputy Williams walked over to Susan. Ma'am, step away from the groceries. But they're not organized properly. Ma'am, they're not your groceries to organize. But, ma'am, step away now. Susan reluctantly backed away from my food, leaving everything scattered across the porch in complete disarray. It took another 20 minutes to get Margaret and Susan to actually leave. They kept coming up with new reasons why they shouldn't have to go to Lake Harmony. It's too dark to drive in the mountains. We don't know the way. What if our cabin isn't as nice as this one? What if there are bears? Deputy Williams patiently addressed each concern while I repacked my groceries and tried to salvage what I could. The steaks were fine, most of the beer was intact, but my bag of chips had been completely destroyed during Susan's organization efforts. Finally, Margaret and Susan got in their SUV and drove away, but not before Margaret rolled down her window one last time. This isn't over, she called out. Ma'am, it is over, Deputy Williams replied. Please drive safely. After they left, Deputy Williams turned to me. I'm sorry about all that. We get a lot of confused tourists, but those two were special. Tell me about it, I said. I just wanted to buy groceries. For what it's worth, you handled that very well. A lot of people would have lost their temper. I was close. I could tell. But you kept your cool, and that probably prevented this from escalating. Deputy Williams helped me finish repacking my groceries, and we stood there for a moment enjoying the peaceful evening. You know, he said, I've been doing this job for 15 years, and I've never seen anyone accuse someone of stealing groceries as part of a cabin theft scheme. Is that a real crime? Cabin theft. Not the way they described it. Though I suppose you could steal a cabin if you really put your mind to it. We both laughed. You have a good weekend, Deputy Williams said as he got back in his SUV. And maybe next time hide your groceries until you're sure you're alone. Good advice. After Deputy Williams left, I finally had the cabin to myself. I grilled my steaks, cracked open a cold beer, and sat on the porch watching the sunset over Lake Serenity. It was perfect. The steaks were delicious, the beer was cold, and the silence was exactly what I had been looking for. No traffic, no neighbors, no crazy women accusing me of elaborate grocery crimes. I pulled out my phone to try to call Jake and tell him about the afternoon's adventure, but there was still no signal. I'd have to wait until I got back to civilization. As I was finishing my second beer, I heard a car in the distance. For a moment, I panicked, thinking Margaret and Susan had returned. But the sound faded away, probably just someone else heading to their own cabin. I spent the rest of the evening reading, listening to the water lap against the shore, and marveling at how quickly a peaceful day could turn into complete chaos. I woke up Saturday morning to the sound of birds and the smell of pine trees. It was exactly the kind of peaceful morning I had been looking forward to. I made coffee, sat on the porch, and watched the mist rise off the lake. Perfect. That's when I heard it. Car doors slamming. I looked down the driveway and saw a white SUV parked at the bottom of the hill. The same white SUV from yesterday. Margaret and Susan were back. But this time they weren't alone. There were two men with them, and they were all walking up the driveway toward the cabin. I grabbed my coffee and went out to meet them, wondering what fresh insanity they had brought with them. Morning. I called out cheerfully. Back for round two? Margaret pointed at me dramatically. That's him. That's the man who stole our cabin and our groceries. One of the men, a tall guy in his 50s, looked embarrassed. Margaret, we talked about this. Don't you start, Robert. This man is a criminal. The second man, younger and clearly uncomfortable, looked at me apologetically. I'm sorry about this. I'm Susan's husband, Dave. She called me last night very upset. She should be upset, I said. She was at the wrong cabin. That's what I tried to tell her, but... He shrugged helplessly. Robert walked over to me. I'm Margaret's husband. I understand there was some sort of misunderstanding yesterday. That's one way to put it, I said. Your wives showed up at my cabin, accused me of stealing it, then accused me of stealing my own groceries. He's lying. Susan piped up. Tell them about the elaborate scheme. What elaborate scheme? Dave asked tiredly. He followed us from the grocery store and stole our cabin. Robert looked at Margaret. Honey, you told me the GPS sent you to the wrong lake. The GPS was hacked. Margaret declared. The GPS was not hacked, Robert said patiently. You put in the wrong address. But look at his groceries. Susan pointed to my coffee cup. He's clearly living a lifestyle he can't afford. Dave stared at his wife. Susan, it's coffee. Expensive coffee. It's Folgers. I was starting to feel bad for these men. They had clearly been dragged into this situation against their better judgment. Look, I said, I understand your wives were confused yesterday. But this is getting ridiculous. You're right, Robert said. Margaret, we need to go. Now. But Robert? Now, Margaret. Dave nodded. Susan, get in the car. But Dave. Car. Now. As the women reluctantly walked back toward the SUV, Robert turned to me. I'm really sorry about this. Margaret gets ideas sometimes. It's fine, I said. Just maybe keep her away from GPS for a while. Good advice. Dave paused as he was leaving. For what it's worth, those steaks you bought yesterday looked really good. They were delicious. Margaret said they were stolen. They were not stolen. I bought them with my own money. I figured. Margaret thinks everything is stolen. After they left, I sat back down on the porch and finished my coffee. It was still only 8 a.m., and I had already dealt with more drama than I usually saw in a month. But the day was still young and I was determined to enjoy my weekend. Saturday afternoon, I was out on the lake in a small rowboat I had found behind the cabin. The fishing was decent, the weather was perfect, and I was finally getting the peaceful weekend I had planned. That's when I heard shouting from the shore. I looked back toward the cabin and saw Margaret and Susan standing on the dock, waving their arms and yelling something I couldn't quite make out. I rowed back to shore, already dreading whatever new crisis they had invented. There you are. Margaret said as I pulled the boat up to the dock. We've been looking everywhere for you. Why were you looking for me? To apologize, Susan said, which was so unexpected I nearly fell out of the boat. Apologize. We went to our actual cabin at Lake Harmony, Margaret explained. And it was terrible. Terrible how? It was tiny, dirty, and right next to a highway, Susan complained. Nothing like the pictures online. And we realized, Margaret continued, that this cabin is so much nicer. So we were thinking, maybe we could share? I stared at them. Share? Just for tonight. We've already paid for our cabin, but we'd rather stay here. This isn't my cabin to share. It belongs to my friend's family. But you have the key, Susan pointed out. Yes, because they gave me permission to stay here. They didn't give me permission to sublet it to random strangers. We're not random strangers. Margaret protested. We've met. You accused me of stealing groceries. We apologized for that, Susan said. No, you didn't. Well, we're apologizing now. I climbed out of the boat and tied it to the dock. I appreciate the apology, but you can't stay here. But why not? Margaret whined. There's plenty of room. Because it's not my cabin. But you're here alone, Susan pointed out. It's not like you're using all the space. I realized they were not going to take no for an answer easily. Look, I said, I understand your cabin isn't what you expected. But this isn't a hotel. You can't just show up and demand to stay. We're not demanding, Margaret said. We're asking nicely. The answer is still no. But we drove all the way back here. That was your choice. Susan stepped forward. What if we paid you? Paid me what? Money? For sharing the cabin. I can't take money for a cabin that isn't mine. But. No buts. You need to go back to your actual rental. That's when Margaret had her brilliant idea. What if we just stayed on the porch? I stared at her. The porch? We have sleeping bags in the car. We could just camp on the porch. You want to camp on someone else's porch? It's not someone else's porch if you give us permission. I can't give you permission to camp on a porch I don't own. But you have the key. We were going in circles. What followed was the most surreal negotiation of my life. Margaret and Susan had somehow convinced themselves that camping on the porch of a cabin they didn't rent was a reasonable solution to their problem. "We'll be very quiet," Susan promised. "You're not being quiet right now. We'll be quieter. You can't camp on the porch." "Why not?" Margaret demanded. "Because it's not your porch." "But you said it's not your porch either." "That's right. It's not anyone's porch." "Then why can't we use it?" "Because that's not how property ownership works." I was starting to get a headache. "Look," I said, "I'm going to be very clear. You cannot stay here. Not in the cabin, not on the porch, not in the driveway. This is private property, and you don't have permission to be here." "But we apologized." Susan protested. "Apologizing doesn't give you squatters' rights." "What if we helped with the groceries?" Margaret suggested. "Helped how?" "We could cook for you. We're excellent cooks. You accused my groceries of being stolen." "We were wrong about that. You also tried to organize them without permission." "We were helping." "You destroyed my chips." "Those were cheap chips." I paused. "How do you know they were cheap chips?" Margaret looked caught. "Lucky guess. You went through my grocery bags again, didn't you?" "We may have peeked." "While I was fishing?" "We were just curious." I walked over to the cabin and checked my groceries. Sure enough, everything had been moved around again. "You went through my stuff while I was on the lake?" "We were looking for evidence," Susan declared. "Evidence of what?" Of criminal activity." "What criminal activity?" "The grocery theft. I showed you the receipt." "Receipts can be forged." We were back where we started. I sat down on the porch steps and took a deep breath. These women were like a force of nature, completely irrational, utterly persistent, and apparently immune to logic. "Okay," I said, "let me try a different approach. What would it take to get you to leave and never come back?" Margaret and Susan looked at each other, then back at me. "We want the groceries," Margaret said. "What?" "As compensation for the emotional distress you've caused us." I stared at her. "I've caused you emotional distress. You've been very rude to us." "I've been rude?" "You accused me of stealing a cabin and committing grocery fraud. And you were very dismissive of our concerns. Your concerns were insane." "That's exactly the kind of rudeness we're talking about." Susan nodded vigorously. "We demand compensation." "For what?" "For the trauma of being falsely accused." "You falsely accused me." "That's different." "How is that different?" "Because we were right." "You were not right. You were at the wrong cabin." "But you were suspicious." "I was suspicious because I was buying groceries?" "You have to admit it was suspicious." I stood up and walked to my car. I was done. "Where are you going?" Margaret called out. "To get cell service so I can call the police." "You can't call the police on us." "Watch me." I got in my car and started driving down the mountain. In my rearview mirror, I could see Margaret and Susan standing in the driveway, apparently arguing about something. About halfway down the mountain, my phone finally got signal. I immediately called Jake. "Hey man, how's the cabin?" Jake answered cheerfully. "Jake, I need to ask you something. Did you rent your cabin to anyone else this weekend?" "No, why?" "Did anyone else have permission to be there?" "Just you." "What's going on?" I told him the whole story. Margaret and Susan showing up, the grocery accusations, the police visit, and now their demands to share the cabin. "Wait," Jake said, "they want to camp on my porch?" "That was their latest proposal, yes." "And they went through your groceries?" "Twice." "Twice that I know of." "Dude, those women are crazy." "I'm starting to realize that." "You want me to call the local sheriff?" "I know Deputy Williams from when we were kids." "That might not be a bad idea." "I'll call him now." "In the meantime, you might want to stay away from the cabin until they're gone." "Where should I go?" "There's a diner in town called Mountain View." "Good pie. I'll call you back in a few minutes." I drove to Mountain View Diner and ordered coffee and a piece of apple pie. It was delicious, but I couldn't enjoy it properly because I kept wondering what Margaret and Susan were doing at the cabin. My phone rang 20 minutes later. "Good news," Jake said. "Deputy Williams is heading up to the cabin now. He said he'll make sure they leave and don't come back." "What if they refuse to go?" "Then he'll arrest them for trespassing." "Really? Really?" "I told him they've been harassing my guest and going through your personal property. He's not happy about it." I felt a wave of relief. "Thanks, Jake. I'm sorry about all this." "Are you kidding? This is the best cabin story ever." I'm definitely using this in my family Christmas letter. I stayed at the diner for another hour, enjoying my pie and watching the sun set over the mountains. Around 8 p.m. my phone rang again. "Coast is clear," Jake said. "Deputy Williams just called. They're gone." "Did they go peacefully?" "Well, define peacefully." "Oh no." Apparently Margaret tried to claim squatters' rights, and Susan attempted to perform a citizen's arrest on you for grocery fraud. "I wasn't even there." "She tried to arrest you in absentia. That's not how citizens' arrests work." That's what Deputy Williams told her. "Anyway, they're gone." He escorted them to the county line and made it very clear that they're not welcome back. "What about their stuff? Did they leave anything at the cabin?" "Just some sleeping bags on the porch and a cooler full of what Deputy Williams described as sad sandwiches." "Sad sandwiches?" His words, not mine. I drove back up to the cabin feeling lighter than I had all day. The driveway was empty, the porch was clear, and everything was exactly as I had left it. Well, almost everything. There was a note taped to the front door. "This isn't over. We know where you grocery shop. Margaret and Susan." I showed the note to Jake when I called him back. "Should I be worried about this?" I asked. "Nah," Jake said. "They're probably halfway back to the city by now, complaining about mountain people and their backwards ways." "You think they'll actually try to find me at the grocery store?" "I think they'll forget about you as soon as they find something else to be outraged about. People like that don't have long attention spans." He was right, of course. But just to be safe, I decided to do my future grocery shopping at different stores for a while. Sunday morning was everything I had hoped the weekend would be. I woke up to the sound of birds, made coffee on the porch, and spent the morning fishing without any interruptions. No crazy women. No accusations of elaborate crimes. No demands to share cabins or camp on porches. Just peace, quiet, and fish that were surprisingly cooperative. I caught 3 decent-sized bass and grilled them for lunch with some of the vegetables I had bought at Pinewood Market. The same vegetables that had been accused of being stolen merchandise. As I sat on the porch eating my fish and watching the lake, I couldn't help but laugh about the whole situation. In 24 hours, I had gone from a simple weekend getaway to being accused of multiple crimes, having my groceries examined as evidence, and being threatened with citizen's arrest. And through it all, the most surreal part was that Margaret and Susan genuinely believed they were the victims. It was almost impressive in a way. The drive home. Sunday afternoon, I packed up my things and headed back to the city. The drive down the mountain was beautiful, and I found myself already planning my next trip to the cabin. Though next time I might ask Jake to change the locks. As I drove through the small mountain towns, I kept an eye out for a white SUV with city plates. Part of me expected to see Margaret and Susan pulled over on the side of the road, arguing with another police officer about their constitutional right to camp on someone else's property. But the drive was peaceful, and I made it back to the city without any Karen-related incidents. 6 months later, I was at a grocery store in my neighborhood when I heard a familiar voice in the next aisle. "Excuse me, but I think you're in our spot." I peeked around the corner and saw Margaret talking to a teenage employee who was stocking shelves. "Ma'am, this isn't a parking spot," the kid said patiently. "This is the cereal aisle." "We were shopping here first," Margaret insisted. "Ma'am, anyone can shop in the cereal aisle. That's not how it works." I quickly finished my shopping and got out of there before she could spot me. Some confrontations aren't worth revisiting. But I did post about it on social media. "Spotted my cabin Karen at the grocery store today, arguing about cereal aisle territorial rights." Some people never change. The post got 500 likes and dozens of comments from people sharing their own Karen stories. A year later, Jake invited me back to the cabin for a weekend fishing trip. I was a little nervous about returning to the scene of the crime, but the weekend was perfect. No unexpected visitors, no grocery accusations, no demands for cabin sharing. On our last morning, we were sitting on the porch drinking coffee when Jake pointed to something in the distance. "Is that a white SUV?" he asked. I looked where he was pointing and saw a white vehicle pulled over on the side of the mountain road about a mile away. "Should we be worried?" I asked. "Nah," Jake said. "Probably just someone with car trouble." But as we watched, the SUV started moving again, driving slowly up the mountain like it was looking for something. "Jake," I said, "I think we should go inside." "Why?" "Because I have a feeling that's not just someone with car trouble." We watched as the SUV turned into our driveway. "Oh no," Jake said. Margaret and Susan got out of the car and started walking toward the cabin. "I can't believe they came back," I said. "Should we call the police?" "Let's see what they want first." Margaret spotted us on the porch and waved cheerfully. "Hello again," she called out. "We were in the neighborhood and thought we'd stop by." "You were in the neighborhood?" I called back. "We're in the middle of nowhere. We were visiting our cabin at Lake Harmony." "Your cabin that you hate?" "We've learned to appreciate it." Susan stepped forward. "We wanted to apologize. Again. And to ask if you'd like to be friends." Jake and I looked at each other. "Friends?" Jake asked. "Yes. We could have cabin neighbor barbecues." "You're not our cabin neighbors," I pointed out. "You're 40 miles away." "Close enough." I realized that Margaret and Susan existed in a reality where normal social rules didn't apply. They had somehow convinced themselves that driving 40 miles to visit people who didn't want to see them made perfect sense. "That's very nice," Jake said diplomatically, "but we're actually heading back to the city in a few minutes." "Oh, that's perfect," Margaret said. "We can follow you." "Follow us?" "To make sure you get home safely. We don't need an escort." "But what if you have car trouble?" "Then we'll call AAA." "But we're already here." I stood up. "Margaret, Susan, I appreciate that you want to be friends, but this is getting weird." "Weird how?" "Driving 40 miles to visit people who barely know you is weird." "We're being neighborly." "You're being stalky." Margaret gasped. "That's a very hurtful thing to say." "It's also true." Jake stepped in. "Ladies, I think it's time for everyone to go home. But we just got here. And now you're leaving." "Says who?" "Says the guy who owns this cabin." Margaret and Susan looked at Jake with surprise, like they had forgotten other people could have authority in situations. "You own this cabin?" Margaret asked. "Yes. But he has the key." Susan pointed at me. "Because I gave it to him." But, that means you could give us a key too." "I could, but I won't." "Why not?" "Because I don't want to." It was beautiful in its simplicity. Margaret and Susan stood there for a moment, apparently trying to process the concept that someone could just say no without a detailed explanation. "Fine," Margaret finally said. "But this is very unfriendly of you." "I can live with that," Jake replied. As they walked back to their car, Susan turned around one last time. "You're missing out on some great friendship opportunities," she called out. "I'll take that risk," I called back. After they drove away, Jake and I sat back down on the porch. "Think they'll be back?" he asked. "Probably." "Should I get a restraining order?" "Maybe just a very large no trespassing sign." "Good idea." And that's how I learned that some people are like boomerangs. No matter how far you throw them, they just keep coming back. P.S. If Margaret and Susan are reading this, please stop following me to grocery stores. And no, I will not be your cabin friend. P.P.S. To anyone planning a peaceful weekend at a remote cabin, hide your groceries, lock your doors, and maybe invest in a good security system. You never know when the Karen sisters might show up. P.P.P.'s Deputy Williams, if you're reading this, thank you for your service. You handled this situation with the patience of a saint.